Hello, folks. Hope you're all doing well. This is the second part of, I think, 4 or 5 parts in Depression and New Deal. This is one of the key events in American history. Civil War and the Depression probably were the two most crucial events where the country almost came to collapse. Mentioned a lot lately, and Franklin Roosevelt has been mentioned a lot lately with the coronavirus crisis. We'll see how we do in comparison to the New Deal, but the example of New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt has often been brought up. This particular episode will be about the economic collapse. We talked about the Dust Bowl. We did not talk in specifics about the economic collapse. At the end of 1929, stock market collapses. People are scared. As Mr. Schwab said, who was one of the richest men of his time, I am afraid, every man is afraid. So there's a lot of connections to the coronavirus here. The economy basically tanked. Following the stock market, it was a downward spiral, and I wish I had the visual for this, but once the economy people get scared, they stop buying. What happens? People are laid off. That means those people can't buy anything. That means more people are laid off. That means those people can't buy anything. And that's the downward spiral. It goes down and down, and nobody knows where it's going to stop. By 1932, when the next presidential election is up, factory production is less than half of what it was at the end of World War I. Steel, for example, was down to 12% of what they were producing 10 years earlier. Cars, 20%. Cotton went from 17 cents to 6 cents a pound. People didn't have the money. You couldn't collect taxes because they weren't employed. This should sound vaguely familiar. So there was no money coming into the federal government, so it could provide relief to anybody. Unemployment at the top, and there's been a lot of mention of this, at the top was roughly 16 million at its peak. This is roughly, again, about 25% to 30%. There were roughly 45 million workers at the time, so 16%, and times it went over that. So 25% is a good number. Some cities had much worse. Industrial cities in the Midwest and in the North. Cleveland, 50% unemployment. Chicago, 50% unemployment. Toledo, which was a steel town, 80% unemployment. Another small steel town in Pennsylvania that had employed 14,000 workers, the steel plants closed, 250 workers, just keeping the buildings from collapsing. At its peak, 100,000 people unemployed per week. This is a time when there's no safety net, there's no insurance, there's no welfare, there's no school lunches, there's nothing. So you're unemployed, there is no money, there's no place to turn. The pretty clear effects, the white collar class was wiped out. If you don't have any money, if you can't buy food, you don't go to a doctor. This should sound familiar. You don't go to a dentist, you don't go to a lawyer, you don't go to a professional if you can avoid it. As the months drag on death certificates in a number of cities, they began to see death by starvation as cause of death. In some cities, they put armed guards on the garbage trucks because people would follow the garbage trucks, and when they dumped the garbage, they would fight over who would get to go through the garbage and find anything edible. In some schools in urban areas, 90% malnourishment. And this is actually a fact that the enlisted men in World War II were shorter than the men in World War I for one reason. They lived through the Great Depression. Those were their formative years. They did not literally have enough food. In World War II, one of three recruits, one of three draftees was rejected because they didn't meet the physical specifications. Cities, particularly hard hit. In the country, you could at least grow a garden. They estimated New York City, 1 out of 3 people was malnourished. When they started recruiting people to work for government agencies, they were finding things like 65% were malnourished. There was scurvy, there were rickets, there were all kinds of third world diseases that you would never see. Poor kids in school, 75% vitamin B deficiencies, 50% vitamin A deficiencies, which means that affects your vision. So things collapsed. People didn't know what to do. They could not eat. They could not feed their families. Another direct effect was a huge increase in mobility. And these slides are after the Dust Bowl. They run from slides 5 to 17. You can see the text in 5 and 6. 6 is the income chart of what average people's incomes dropped. In some cities, slide 11, charities, churches particularly, created food lines. You'll notice that the men in this line are all male because it was considered the breadwinner who would be given food. So I don't know what happened to single women, but they did not like single women showing up. They lost their homes. You could not pay the rent. You could not pay the mortgage. You were thrown out. If you look at slide 12, in every city there were, hang on, let me pull this up again. There were Hoovervilles, they called them, because Hoover was the president. And basically, these are shanty towns made out of cardboard, scrap metal, whatever you could build. Every city had areas of Hoovervilles around it. Mobility. Estimated young men, 1 to 2 million on the road. Could not feed their families sometimes, or the oldest kids, I'm sorry, we cannot feed you, son, you'll have to leave so the food can be saved for the younger children. Estimated well over 1 million. They rode the rails. In 1932, the peak of the Depression, the Southern Pacific Railway actually kept a record, and they threw 680,000 hobos, homeless men, off of the trains because they would jump the trains and sleep in the boxcars. Later on, they gave up and actually added empty freight cars so that homeless men could actually sleep and transit in them. Many people in cities moved back to farms if they had a place to move to. Mexican Americans who had been brought in, particularly after World War I, and when the economy was good for farm labor, were deported, close to 500,000, often by force, including 200,000 of their kids who were natural-born U.S. citizens. Hispanics were excluded from relief jobs, could not apply for anything, could not stand in food lines. So most of them were deported. Social collapse, which we never hear that much about, but we're going to hear a lot about in the next couple of months. 1930s had the lowest birth rate of any decade in American history, also the lowest marriage rate, the highest suicide rate, and the highest divorce rate. And it was not uncommon in every community for men to just walk off. They just couldn't feed their families. They couldn't deal with hungry children, oftentimes walked off. Sometimes the wife and kids could get relief if the man wasn't there. If you had a man in the family, the assumption was he should go find work someplace. It is also not at all rare, not common, but not rare for both parents to walk off and leave the kids. They would leave them in a park. They would leave them in front of a government agency or a police station, and both of them would take off. Couldn't deal with not being able to feed their kids. The amazing thing is churches and relief agencies, of course, are totally overwhelmed with 1 out of 4, 1 out of 3 people unemployed. They couldn't deal with it. It's not a few people. It's 1/4 of the population. Very little violence in cities. You would think, but it didn't happen. The only thing that happened was gangs of men, it was always men, not the women, would gang together and go into grocery stores as a group, grab everything they could and walk out. If it was one guy, he could be arrested. If 300 did it, there was nothing they could do. And basically all they were looking for was food for their families. 1 per family got a job, 1 per family got aid in the Depression. So women usually didn't. They had a hard time proving they were the job winner for their family. In 20 states, they tried to ban women completely from any government job. They couldn't get anything. Of course, bottom of the barrel, African Americans, 50% unemployment. They were also excluded from some New Deal job programs. Native Americans, always the same. Their average income fell to about $50 per family per year, which is not even survival rate. They were pretty much ignored. What happened to the rich in the Depression? Amazingly enough, they were not openly attacked too much. This is the head of the American Manufacturers Association, the head of the business organization. The suffering of the unemployed was not due to an economic breakdown, but to the weakness and incompetence of the unemployed. Factory owners during the Depression, actually, those that stayed in business, actually lowered wages. Why? Because they could get anybody they want. But unlikely, there was no vandalism of wealthy people, with a few exceptions. Lots of strikes. Workers went on strike. There were 2,000 strikes in 1934 alone. Some of them immediately became violence, particularly in the Steel Belt, in the old Midwestern towns, San Francisco dock workers, 400,000, 500,000 textile workers working in textile factories struck and actually got recognition of the United Textile Workers for the first time. So they begin to fight back, but there's no place to go because in the beginning, until 1932, there's no government agency. Slides 16 and 17 deal with the Bonus Army. The Bonus Army was a group of World War I veterans. They were promised a pension for fighting in World War I. Their pension was supposed to begin in 1945 when they were about retirement age. Unfortunately, the Depression hits, 1929. By 1932, they're starving, they're unemployed. And they created and self-regulated an army. 20,000 rode the rails to Washington, D.C. They were asking for their bonus, their pension, early. We need it now. We're hungry. Our families are hungry. They had no place to go. Many of them brought their families. They created a camp on empty government land and empty government buildings. They were peaceful. They were organized. These are veterans, so the ex-officers organized them. They actually, and this has been verified, drove out anybody who was advocating violence. They were completely peaceful. They were so cooperative that the police chief in Washington, D.C. actually helped them out, found them places to stay, collected food, and donated food and equipment to them. So they built basically a Hooverville, a shanty town. Unfortunately, the Senate has no money. The Senate rejected their petition. We don't have the money to pay a bonus, to pay your pensions. Herbert Hoover refused to meet with them, did not want to be seen with them. Started getting worried after a couple of months. These guys had no place to go. They hung out in Washington, D.C. and lived out handouts. And after the first couple of months, it's terrible PR for Hoover, the president, and he calls in the Army. The guy in charge of the Army battalion that was called in is a man named Douglas MacArthur. Keep an eye on him because he's going to return later. He was given orders. Don't let them come further into Washington, D.C. towards government buildings. Don't let them cross this street. Douglas MacArthur disobeyed presidential orders, crossed the street, attacked the Hooverville, attacked the Bonus Army camp with bayonets, with tear gas. At the end, they torched it, they burned it all down, and these men basically disappeared. They had nothing now. They and their families basically dissipated and slowly dissolved, and the whole movement was over. The result of that is that they were really, when the press got hold of this, the public supported the Bonus Army, and Hoover got a black eye out of it. When Franklin Roosevelt becomes president, they resubmit their petition to get their pensions. Still no money in the federal government. The petition was refused again, but the difference is Franklin and Eleanor came out to the camps, met with the leaders, brought them food supplies, even passed out coffee and donuts. So very different approach to the homeless between Republican Hoover and Democrat Franklin Roosevelt. Okay, the next episode, still continuing on this slide series, will be Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt. Stay tuned.